We all know that COVID 19 led to learning losses thanks to school closures across the world, including in India. The Bangalore based Azim Premji Foundation, one of the world's largest value of endowments, works with some 285,000 teachers and touches close to 6.5 million students. It discovered during a field study that there was significant loss of learning during the pandemic, and students were falling behind in the current academic year, but also had forgotten foundational concepts from previous grades, notably in language and mathematics. The foundation works with, as it does, several state governments on a recovery program that started working with teachers in January 2022 and went on till the end of the academic year of 23-24. The foundation says their subsequent studies showed substantial improvements in learning across grades, especially primary grades, and for some 6.5 million children, recovery was 3 times as much compared to places where they had no intervention. Other states who also worked on this learning recovery approach had similar results. My guest for today is Anurag Behar, CEO of the Azim Premji Foundation and also founding Vice Chancellor of the Azim Premji University. Behar, who was CEO of Wipro Infrastructure Engineering in another life, spends almost half the year on the road visiting schools in the furthest corners of the country, which also led him to write a book called The Matter of the Heart: Education in India. In this edition, I speak to Anurag and dive into details of the Foundation's education interventions, particularly in the context of COVID-19, and try and understand the nuts and bolts of how it worked, and whether this model, most importantly, can be replicated to address larger educational gaps in the country, and if so, how. Hi, Anurag. Thank you for joining me. So, we're going to talk about the efforts that Azim Premji University and Foundation put in the context of addressing learning loss because of pandemic-induced school closures. Now, we all know that schools shut down across the country, urban India, rural India, and a lot of children faced challenges in getting back to normal life, so to speak. And some of the studies that we've seen subsequently, including from ACER, show that there was a learning loss. But your own interventions, however, seem to suggest that if you were to bring in an accelerated intervention at student level, teacher level, curriculum level, you can actually correct this loss. So, the idea of this conversation is to try and understand how this happened and what were the tools you used, so to speak. So maybe you could first tell me about how you decided to approach this problem and how you actually started about building the approach or the response to this.
Yeah, thanks, Govind. So, before we get on to that, let's just characterize what are we talking about.
Sure.
Uh, the schools during the COVID period were roughly, I can't say they were shut, but they were sort of disrupted for about 2 years, from let's say March of 2020 to about December 21 or Jan 22. Right now, this disturbance or this disruption of schools, and a large part of that, they were actually just shut. It led to two kinds of, let's say, losses of learning. Two kinds of losses of learning. One kind of loss of learning is that during that period, let's say a child who's in grade 3 or grade 4 or grade 5 or whatever, during that period, she's supposed to learn something. And since the classes are not happening, she's not learning. Right? So that's one kind of loss of learning. The other kind of loss of learning is that if children are not going to school for such a long time, and let's remember that we are talking about a very large number of children of the country who have very little home support for learning, right? So these are not kids from upper middle class homes who have books and material. Very many of these kids are parents who may not have gone to school. So that's what we were talking about. So one kind of loss of learning is stuff that they did not learn because classes didn't happen. The other kind of loss of learning is that because they did not go to school for such a long time, or going to school was disrupted, they forgot what they had learned. Right? And it's not an unknown phenomena. In fact, across schooling, the phenomena of summer loss, as it's called, which is during the summer break, is well known. But this is like a loss at a huge scale. So those are two kinds of losses of learning, right? Now, during that 2-year period, there were kind of interventions that we did, various governments did, other organizations did, as to how does one limit that, or how does one reduce that loss of learning, so to say. And I'll not get into that. Let's just get back to what you're talking about, which is that how then do you recover that lost learning? Right? Now, let's take that characterization one level deeper. So, what's happening here is that you had a kid who had just entered grade three, grade three in, let's say, April of 2020. And in April 21, she went into grade four. By the time you hit April 25, April 22, she's in grade five. Now, when she was in grade three, let's assume reasonable, she had built some degree of what is called foundational literacy and numeracy, basic language and basic math, right? But because of the disruption, not only did she not learn what was supposed to be happening in grade three, but she started forgetting how to read, how to do basic math. So, and this is, there's a variation around this. Some kids will forget less, some kids will forget more. All that is there. So I'm just talking about the average. So the first important thing when the schools opened was to actually have a method by which when you enter a classroom, whether it's grade 5, grade 4 or whatever, you should be able to assess what is it that the children know. You can't start from the grade 5 syllabus. You actually, because in the same class, let's assume with a class 5 with 30 kids, 15 kids have forgotten a lot, 5 have forgotten less, you know, uh, 3 have not forgotten at all. Now, what are you going to do? So, the first most important thing is to be able to have, let's call it an assessment method, by you're able to assess what is the learning that has been retained, and therefore, by implication, what is lost uh, by the kids in the class, and knowing fully well that kids have sort of lost less or more depending on the individual child. So now you have sort of a group of kids lost a lot more. Kids in grade 5 who've just forgotten altogether to read and to do math. On the other hand, kids who can sort of do a little bit and here and there. Now, once you've done that, now just remember it's the same class. So you have the same class, the same room, the same teacher. Once you've done that, then you should be able to actually have, let's call it the curriculum. And curriculum is a big word, and we'll break it down in a bit. Uh, but we need to have a curriculum which can then address these specific groups of kids. Just for the sake of the explanation, let's just divide these kids into 3 groups. In the class of 30 in grade 5, let's say 15, 17 kids were completely forgotten how to read, how to write, how to do basic math. Another 5, 7 kids who remember somewhat, and another 5 who sort of are reasonably good. Now, when I'm saying a curriculum, what you need really is that you need to have, let's say, material meaning worksheets and some stuff, which actually starts from the very basics for these kids, the kids who have just completely forgotten. You're in fact teaching them pretty much at grade 1 level. So you have, again, for the sake of description, you have material, reading stuff or basic letter or, simple sentences, stuff on which they can write, which is really grade 1 kind of stuff, right? Uh, for the second group, which is somewhat remembering of it, you have something which is, let's say, grade 2 or grade, and then you have others who sort of remember most of it. That's perhaps the simplest way to understand. And it's not from a conceptual perspective, it's not a complicated thing. Because what's happening is that you have a grade 5, where essentially you have kids who are at grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4. So conceptually, you're not doing something dramatically new. It's just that you are assessing where those kids stand. And then you're able to get the material in, which is relevant for that level of learning. So conceptually, it's not complicated. It's operationally very hard. Operationally is very hard, because you just, there's 30 kids, and how do you deal with it, because they're all at completely different levels of learning. That's so that really was the key issue. How do you operationally tackle that? And therefore that requires training the teacher adequately, resourcing the teacher adequately, and most importantly, the government system, and because I'm referring mostly to public schools, the government system instructing the teacher that this is the right method to do it. The most extreme cases could have been, and unfortunately did happen in certain states, is that you just ignore the entire loss of learning and just start from grade 5 syllabus, right? So yeah, so conceptually not very hard, but operationally very complex.
Right. And we are talking about 6.5 million children from what I can see. And I'll come to that in a second. But what is the methodology or method that you use to first assess where the child stands today? Is it I mean, is it just one test which tells you that, or is it something more comprehensive?
So Govind, one that 6.5 million children that you're referring to is related to the schools that we were working with.
Okay.
But the same situation is there across the all the schools in the country. So no, we are talking about 200 million
Yeah.
or 240 million children, right? So that's just stuff that we were working with, right? So yeah, uh, again, Govind, uh, conceptually, the assessment tool is not complicated. It's exactly what you said, that if you have an assessment tool and it's like a test paper, which is very graded. So normally, if you are a grade 5 test paper, you're assessing the child at grade 5, right? Or some competency which is slightly below grade 5. But here you have a test paper, and I'm just calling it a test paper, just for the sake of simplicity. Here you have a test paper, which essentially has some questions which are at grade 5 level, some at grade 4, grade 3, grade 2, grade 1, right? So depending on what the child is able to answer, then you are able to understand where she is. I mean, let me give you an example. It's like saying uh, you'll have a full paragraph of text, and you'll have the question will be, can you please read this paragraph, understand, and rewrite it in your own words? Now, that's grade 4 kind of competency, grade 3, grade 4 kind of competency. Then you will have some set of questions which are like saying, can you just read this sentence and say what is the name of the father? Can you just write that? You already you can see that it's grade 2 level. So again, conceptually, it's not something complicated. Operationally, to be able to develop that, to be able to administer that, to each child, then to be able to draw the conclusions from that, and on that basis regroup the children, and then manage the children continually and for quite a period of time. That is what is really hard.
Right. So take us through that. So, as you are now imparting essentially two levels of learning, one is to catch up, and the second is really what you should be learning right now. Say, let's say it's class four or class five, as the case may be. How does that work in terms of the child's own participation, the teacher's participation, the time spent with them? Is it more time? Is it accelerated time? Is it intense time?
So Govind, one more thing. I mean, it's not two levels of learning, it's multiple levels. I mean,
Okay.
so I mean, let's say if you make it concrete, I mean, if I were to look at grade 4 or grade 5, right, there would be at least 3 or 4 different levels, right? I mean, kids in 3 or 4 different kinds of groups. A very small percentage where you can more or less be at the grade, more or less be at the grade. A significant percent which is significantly behind, let's say a year behind or a year and a half behind. Another group which is like 2 years behind, and another group which is sort of beginning. And I should have pointed out earlier. This problem is particularly grave in the primary grades, particularly grave in primary grades, because uh, and there is a acute crisis of foundational literacy and numeracy as it is. So we should, for a moment, keep that aside. But if you're in grade 7, and you can sort of, if your imagination will just take you there, if you're in grade 7, if you have understood, I mean, if you have literacy and numeracy, that you're not going to forget because you've done it for many, many years now, right? In grade 7, what's happening is you have to say, look, oh my God, in grade 7, you're going to learn about light and about heat and about something. Let's not learn about light and heat altogether. Let's do heat next year. It's that kind of reformulation in some senses, right? So I'm I know my friends in education will castigate me for that because I'm oversimplifying it a bit. But nevertheless, the issues in middle, which is 6th to 8th and beyond, are relatively less. The the greater complication was in the primary grades, right? So now let's come back to your question, which is that so you identify these kids. Now you group those kids. You also have what I was calling learning material. Let's just call them worksheets or books or stuff, which is relevant for that level of learning for those kids. That's something that you have. It's just very hard. There's no way around it. It's very, very hard. So you put them in different groups. The kids who are most behind clearly need a lot more attention, right? And then, I mean, let's say if, for example, I will talk about one strategy. One simple strategy was, do not think of your school, and let's think of a primary school, grade 1 to grade 5. Do not think of your school in organized around grades. Don't do that, because you have some kids in grade 5 who just don't know how to read and write and do base math. Some exactly in the similar level in grade 4, some exactly in the similar level in grade 3. And pretty much everybody in grade 1 is like that. It's better to group them together instead of saying I'll group grade 5 together, right? So that's a critical operational strategy, because then what's happening is you're reconfigured your school not around grades but around what the children actually know and from where you have to teach them, right? That was a very critical strategy. So you have the material, you regroup the kids, and very clearly the kids who are most behind, right? They need the most attention. And even within that, again, it's perhaps obvious, but the kids who are in grade 1 and don't know how to read and write and do math, they have a much longer sort of possibility. They got the next 2 3 years. But the grade 5 kids who don't know how to read, write, and who don't know how to do math because they've forgotten it, they need the most amount of attention. So yeah, so assess, identify, group, but don't group in grades. Regroup them according to what really they understand, what they know. Administer and then use your material, and you have to stay with it. And clearly those who are fallen most behind need the most attention.
Right. So as you go along, or as you went along, were you testing to see whether this strategy was working at all, and then course correcting if so, or were you so sure? I mean, were you sure that this will work, and therefore you did not really have to do much course correction subsequently?
uh, so Govind, I mean, it'll seem as I'm just repeating that particular line. From an educational perspective, from a conceptual perspective, what I'm saying is nothing new, nothing dramatic, no great insight, nothing. I mean, it's just the basic thing, right? That you go into any class, any group of children, you must teach the child from where the child is, right? In fact, one of the big problems in our schooling system is that we tend to assume that any class, forget about the pandemic shutdown and all, any class, all children are knowing exactly the same thing. So you start teaching them same thing exactly. So it's the basics of education that you must teach children from where they are, right? So therefore, conceptually, we are not talking about anything new. We know this is exactly what works uh, in this unfortunate circumstance of after shutdown and also in normal classrooms. It's the operational part that's hard, right? And when I say operational part, it's hard is the teacher handling such classes or the school handling such classes, which are reconfigured like this, is very hard. The pressure is very hard, because just think of it, which is that if you have a grade 5 kid and and the kid doesn't know how to read and write and do math, not for any fault of hers, you're saying, look, I got to do all that stuff. I got to do all that stuff and catch up on grade 5 before she goes out, right, into grade 6. So that pressure is very hard. In fact, the best of states that I came across, and I must say that when we are talking about our work, our work is entirely in collaboration with state governments. So, I mean, to whatever extent we were successful, we is not Azim Premji Foundation alone. It is a state system. Some of the states did magnificently well. Right? Some of the states did a really good job of saying, look, we will focus on recovering the lost learning, because it makes no sense if you've not recovered the lost learning. I mean, let's say a kid doesn't know how to read and write and do basic math, and you say, okay, fine, no. We'll, we'll go back to the grade 5 book. It makes no sense at all, right? So some states were clear. They said, look, we will focus on recovering lost learning and let's recover it to some reasonable levels with every child. And only then do we expect to return back to the syllabus for grade 5 or whichever grade we're talking about, right? Unfortunately, some states didn't do that. Some states sort of, tended to mostly ignore the situation. And they said, look, irrespective of where the kids are, we will just, we'll just return back to this year's syllabus. So you can imagine the complication and the irrationality of it, actually.
So, working with the teachers, because obviously they've played a critical role in this and their own adjustment to this process. Obviously, it was difficult, but can you tell us some of the operational challenges that you faced, and how did it become smoother? Because I'm assuming it did over a period of time.
Let me start from where I ended the last response, which is that uh, it became smoothest when the school education system in that particular state was unambiguous about its communication, absolutely unambiguous about its communication and instruction, that let us focus on recovering lost learning, leave the current year syllabus aside. I think, uh, you know, uh, in systems, if you have clarity of direction, that helps a lot. And because if you have the clarity of direction, from the teacher and the principal and the block education officer, everybody is aligned behind that. So I think that clarity of direction and alignment was very, very important. Uh, the second thing that helped was just good material. Because again, if I take you back to that situation where you have a group of 15, 17, 20 kids, some of them are 6-year old and some of them are 10-year old, but they're learning the same thing, right? Now, do you have the material which is graded and then can take the 10-year old quite quickly, back to relatively closer to her learning or her grade standards, right? So, did you really have good material? Right? I think that was the other thing that helped. Uh, Lastly, training. I mean, teacher training and support was very important, because if teachers are not used to handling groups of this kind, mixed groups of this kind, then how are they going to handle it? And therefore, the training, and also when one says training, it becomes sort of mysterious. Oh, what is this stuff that you're training them on? It's very often not anything mysterious. It's just often giving them the, shall we say, the confidence and the comfort that address each child, try and address each child and her learning needs. You know, take it easy. Take it easy, because if you do things at the pace at which the child is really learning, then things will be easier later. And if you do it rapidly in the desire to complete syllabus or to get on with it, you're going to create further problems for yourself, right? So training is also not some mysterious stuff. It is just how do you then handle this kind of a situation is more of what it was, right?
So, from your vantage point, did you have like a monitoring room or something which was tracking various metrics from a teacher, and what teachers were doing or where they were? Because clearly, you work with many schools and teachers as well, and across multiple states and districts and villages and towns within that.
Yeah, well, monitoring room sounds uh, monitoring room sounds very fancy. Yeah, we didn't have a
Corporate.
monitoring room. I mean, uh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So there was no monitoring room as such. It's just a constant process, I mean, if you're doing this all the time, and again, let me point it out, it's not our effort. I mean, we working with the state systems. So the state systems, and we were fully involved, and we are continually, let's say, assessing how it's going, right? And again, how it's going, because operationally you need to keep tweaking it. Operationally, you need to keep tweaking it. So we're continually involved, continually engaged, continually assessing where things are going. And when I say things are going, not at some high level, it has to be at the classroom level. Where is it going? What is the teacher needing support of? Is the material sufficient? Right? And so on and so forth. So yeah, it's just an operationally very hard thing. Huh?
And what about parents? Did you face any? I mean, was there resistance? Was there active participation or encouragement?
No, there was no resistance at all. I mean, there's absolutely no resistance. I think, uh, I mean, pretty much all parents were familiar with the problems that the COVID pandemic had posed for their children's education. So I think they were, I mean, I can't remember even one incident where we had any kind of, we meaning again, the school system had any kind of a problem with the parents, right? In fact, I could think of the reverse, where I do remember a few incidents where parents were very upset as, what is this you guys are doing? 2 years you've been shut down. Now my kid comes and doesn't know this, and you're, not paying adequate attention. So it was exactly the reverse. No, I don't think anything. I can't remember a single incident.
So, if we were to now look at how this phased out, so the program started in 22 Jan and it closed in 23-24, the academic year of 23-24, which is last year. Now, at that point, did you feel that, at least in the sample set that you're working with, you had reached a level of, let's say, equilibrium? And if so, what was that level like, even for the way you would have tested it?
Yeah. So I think one thing that let's sort of put a marker on here is that even before the pandemic, even before the pandemic, without the school shutdowns, etc., we are familiar that too many of our children, or too large a proportion of our children in grade 5 or grade 6 or grade 4, can't read, write well, or as you would expect them to do in that grade, right? We know that. So now when you cut to 23 or 24 or whatever, right? One basic thing is, I mean, you can't expect that we've compensated for decades of issues. That's not happening. But are you at least back? I mean, first of all, the kids who lost the learning, the specific kids, right? I mean, the specific loss of learning that kids have you recovered that? I mean, that's question one. Forget about some national average, right? So this child forgot all this, should have known all this. Is she back? That's one kind of a thing. Uh, and that's what we really were focused on. And I think in there's a very wide variation. But the fact is that wherever state systems did this kind of an approach, what I've described to you, and wherever good ground level support was available to the state systems, in many places by our own organization, by some other organizations in other places, the recovery of learning was dramatically higher. I mean, the last study that we did was 3 times higher. So that's not a small thing, right? I mean, 3 times higher. So I mean, let's say if you're recovering 10 percentage points in places where you have no ground level support, uh, in other places we recovered 30% points where the ground level support was there. And of course, both have to go together. The state system must, uh, indicate, instruct to follow this approach that I was talking about, right? And there is adequate ground level support. So in those cases, the recovery was significantly higher. I don't think that I mean, we are now in 25, right? So it's very hard to sort of separate what's going on. What is the effect of what, so after such a long time. But uh, anecdotally, we don't, our assessment is that we have not recovered uh, all the learning, right? We don't think so. But it's very hard. I mean, these effects are so complex, right? It's very hard to sort of attribute that this was the lost learning because of the pandemic, which has now not been recovered. Very difficult to do that. But and I mean, the reality is that, let's say, um, I mean, we'll be working very closely with, let's say, 1 lakh teachers every month. That means, roughly 1 lakh classrooms every month. So we have a reasonable, I mean, even when I'm saying it's anecdotal, it's a very large number of anecdotes. And, I don't want to paint a picture that good work has not happened, or significant recovery is not, it has happened. It's happened. But, I mean, have we recovered everything? I would think not.
Yeah, and I think that comes to the or brings us to the point about the marker that you talked about, and if I can spend a little time on that, because that is the larger issue in a way that we are. I mean, there is a headwind problem here, which is that children are even without a pandemic-induced closure, we're already suffering from, let's say, some kind of lost learning for various reasons, and that continues to be the problem even today as we are. So, my larger question is, if this approach of really reconfiguring and recalibrating the very classroom in as you did in these 2 years with along with these state governments who are obviously very willing and perhaps leading it worked at that point, is that something that can be done, and is there something in this which can be used as a template for or even the larger sort of education gap challenge that we face today, whether it's primary or pre-primary?
Govind, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Which is that, and this is a phrase that one should never be using. But you want to look for silver linings out of all this, all the tragedies and the problems that came in the wake of the pandemic. It's not a silver lining, but it's something that should give us confidence that we know how to do it. We know how to do it. And then if we and when I say we know how to do it, it's not just uh, technical knowledge, it's the operational capacity, right, of our state systems, that we can actually do it. So if we put our mind to it, put our hearts to it, we go behind it, it can work. It works. It will work, right? And it's not something deeply mysterious. This matter of making sure that almost all our children gain foundational literacy and numeracy. It's not some very mysterious stuff. We understand the methods. Our systems have the capacities. We just need to energize them and set them in a certain direction. And I also think, I must also mention this experience, strangely enough, this experience has given, I would think, confidence to teachers as well. Because a lot of the stuff that was talked about earlier was in some senses an abstraction. But today they've seen that, they've gone through so much and they've somehow been able to recover, so much that was lost. So, their sort of disposition is very different, that they think a huge number of teachers think that they can actually do it because they've done it now.
So, is there any, are there lessons here then in the very approach to the way students are taught? So, assuming, let's say, if we again go by some of these ESSA reports, and of course, there are, which you pointed out right in the beginning, in the same class of, let's say, 20, there's no homogeneity in terms of learning or retention because there would be 10 who are back, maybe 5 who are ahead, and 5 who are somewhere where they should be. So, if this is the prevalent situation, then does that mean that particularly at primary level, we should reconfigure the way we teach, or should these things only be interventions as and when required, like we had during COVID?
So, Gobind, we should reconfigure the way we teach, learn, etc. Right? And again, this is not something that educationists have not been aware of, or people. Education is a too grand a word again. So people involved in education, teachers have not been aware of, or they've not been wanting, or our policies have also not been wanting. Right? I mean, we've been saying this stuff for a long time, right? Very long time. So we know we've not done it adequately. What this episode demonstrates is that what we've known should actually be done, and we can do it. And so we should just go ahead and do it.
Just to come back to that ACER study, which the latest one, and I'll just pick a couple of points. So it said that the proportion of standard 5 children who could do basic numerical division, that's 3 digits by 1 digit, had declined from about 28% in 18 to 25.6 in 22. And that's obviously through the COVID period, but it increased to about 31% in 24, which was higher than what it was in 2014. Now, I don't know, and this is of course in the case of maths. Now, does this extrapolate elsewhere? Is this a good figure? And how does this apply to the work that you're doing?
I'm unfamiliar with the details of this year's ASAR report. I think the thing is that these are all marginal differences that we are seeing, right? I mean, between 19 and 24 or whatever. What it doesn't take away is that we have a fundamental and huge learning crisis. Whether it is 21%, or I forget the numbers, 21% or 23%, it's a huge learning crisis that we are facing. Absolutely huge learning crisis that we are facing. And that, to go back to your earlier question, we actually know how to address it. We need to put our might behind getting that done. The National Education Policy, I think you're familiar, it takes on the Foundational Literacy and Numeracy Challenge as the first key challenge, right? And unfortunately, when NEP 2020 was, it was sort of approved, you immediately had COVID, right? Immediately had COVID. But I think the directions, the push that's there for foundational literacy and numeracy, which is absolutely desperately needed in NEP 2020, it's there. What it tells us, we can make it happen, right? So I won't go to a point study between 19 and 20 and 23 and 24 and take any great heart from it. It is that we are still way behind where our children should be in all grades, actually.
Right. Anurag, you travel a lot, including to many of the schools that you work with across the country. So, what's I mean, I'm sure you come across encouraging and encouraging stories, heartwarming, instances of people who are obviously fighting and doing something despite all the other challenges. Anything that comes to your mind from your most recent travels?
Yeah, so I was in a school, and I mean, like, yeah, a few weeks ago, I was in a school, and so I went into the school, and there were three classes. There was no teacher. There was no teacher, but all the kids, they were, bent down over their notebooks, and they're writing stuff. And I spent a bit of time in the grade 4, and I what are you doing? I asked, and they were doing math, but combined with language. So it's like saying, it's like oh, there were 47 monkeys, and the 47 monkeys, somebody threw a stone, and 15 went away, right? And if 15 went away and 20 came in, and they wanted to eat bananas, and they had, 45 bananas, how many bananas? That's just, now what's happening there is that you are actually not just doing math, but you're doing language, right? Now, the absolutely remarkable thing was that all these kids, or all may be too strong, but most of the kids were able to do this. And that is true of grade 4, grade 5, and grade 3, right? All these grades. And the teacher is not there, right? And the teacher has been sent for some election duty somewhere. Um, and so it was just incredible, absolutely incredible. So I was there for a bit, and then the teacher came back, and one did not need any further demonstration of what I heard from my colleagues later, that this man was just incredible. Through the COVID period, through the COVID period, he would actually go from mohalla to mohalla, collecting the kids in open and actually teaching them. So, in some senses, he did his best to make sure that even during the school disruption, school closure, the children continue to learn. And then, of course, subsequently, when the schools sort of opened up, he did everything that we were talking about, and he did just marvelously well, right? But this, this kind of a classroom would any teacher anywhere will be proud of. And remember, this is a government school in some, I don't want to name the state, but some place when if from the nearest airport, you'll have to drive 8 hours to get to that place, 7 8 hours to get to the place, right? And that's the kind of place I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're saying that these students or children were self-driven to do their homework or their studies, despite the fact that there was no teacher present in the classroom for a fairly substantial period of time.
Correct, correct. And the self drive with kids of that age, and sitting quietly in a classroom, quietly meaning they were having fun. It's not because all those 60 odd kids were like that. It's because the teacher has developed the school culture, the classroom culture, developed the interest and keenness of the students in that manner. So it's not just the way the kids have learned math and language, which is truly to the credit of the teacher, but even more so, how is it that he has developed this culture in the classroom, where even when he's away for 3 hours, these kids are just focused on doing that. It's extraordinary education, an education in its broadest sense, not merely writing and reading and math.
Anurag, that's a great anecdote and story to end our conversation on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Govind. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.